This is a demonstration video for the new minimum financial support calculator. Before opening this online calculation tool, I'm going to briefly go over the changes made to the RAP rates as of the 1st of January 2022. And I'm going to also review the new features of the calculator. And then we'll demonstrate how to use the calculator. And at the end, we will talk about who you can contact. So for the recent changes to the RAP rates, for private sponsorship cases, the new RAP rates came into effect on the 1st of January 2022. For government-sponsored refugees and blended visa office referred refugees, those rates came into effect towards the end of 2021. So if you have an arrival in 2022 or had an arrival in 2021, and the sponsorship period runs into 2022, then you must use the new RAP rates from January 1st, 2022 and onwards. Increases to the basic needs allowance and shelter allowance was made for BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and Ontario. And the senior rates were updated for Ontario only. No changes were made to the Alberta RAP rates. And the reason for the increases is to bring RAP rates in alignment with provincial social assistance rates. The communication allowance increased from $30 a month per file to $75 a month in all provinces to cover monthly internet and data costs, as sponsored newcomers will be accessing more services virtually due to the pandemic. The age of majority standardized to 18 in all provinces. It was previously 19 years old in BC, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. Now, please note, this is still the age of majority in those provinces. However, for the purposes of RAP rate calculations, it has been standardized across Canada. And because of standardization, the age of majority top-up does not need to be provided from January 1st, 2022 onwards in BC, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. The transportation rates have been standardized for the Greater Toronto Area and Hamilton, along with the regions of Halton, Peel, York, and Durham. So the rate is now $156 per adult. This has been done because sponsored newcomers may need to use transit systems of the various municipalities in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. So the rate is now aligned with the highest monthly fare in the region. The monthly transportation allowance can still be waived in areas with no public transit system if alternative transportation is provided at no cost to the refugee, or if the allowance is provided in kind, such as through free bus passes or access to programs for low-income residents. New features of the calculator. There is now an export function that allows the calculation that you have done online to be downloaded as an Excel spreadsheet, which can then be shared electronically or even printed out. There is also a feature where you can hover over descriptions added for each of the startup and monthly allowances. We now have a field where you can enter in the date of arrival, which allows for prorated calculations for the first and last month of arrival, and also calculates school startup costs twice if the sponsorship period covers 2 school years. And alternatively, an unknown checkbox option can be selected for the date of arrival if you're doing the calculation at the time of submission for calculating an estimate. So changes to the age of majority are being standardized, as I mentioned, for RAP purposes only. There's also a summary table that is included now to show total calculations. When including a dependent child who is over the age of majority, children 18 or older in all provinces must now receive financial support as single adults. which is now being calculated within the same browser window, but adding a new calculation tab. And we'll take a look at that shortly. To get to the calculation tool, you're going to want to type in rstp.ca into your web browser. Navigate to the Responsibilities menu item. Scroll down until you can see Minimum Financial Support Calculator. Click on that, and the calculation tool page will open for you. Some features I want to point out to you is if you would like to increase the font size, you can increase or decrease it here to be able to show the font size a little bit better. Over here on the top right is that download button to export an Excel spreadsheet. So we're going to take a look at that later. And whenever you see a little question mark, you can hover over it and it will give you some more information to read. So this is just telling you to click here to export the minimum financial support in order to print or file it for your records. So when you first open this, it's really important to read all of this information, but basically to summarize it for you, it's an explanation saying that sponsors should always refer to the documents for the most up-to-date information, so the RAT rates and the frequently asked questions PDF document that IRCC has provided, and that the amounts that are being calculated in this tool are an estimate. You, of course, will need to account for any case-specific allowances that you might need to include that are not being calculated using these calculation tools. They are calculating, in general, a pretty close estimate for the amount of money that you'll be required to provide to the refugees upon arrival. So if you scroll down, you're going to see the summary section I talked about. And of course, we haven't done any calculations, so we're going to pass that and we'll come back to it in a little bit. So for the calculation tool, you have a tab for the principal applicant, the spouse, and any dependents who are under the age of majority, so under the age of 18. This is who you will include here. So for the purposes of our demonstration, we're just going to do a single adult who has a dependent child who is over the age of 18. So for this single adult, they're going to be located in the Greater Toronto area in Ontario. And I'm going to select unknown date. This is going to be an application submission calculation that I'm going to do. So the family size is 1. I also have to indicate the composition. So I want to select from the list, who are we talking about? This is a single individual, but are they under 22 or not? If this parent was a senior citizen, we would select single senior citizen, but they're not. They aren't the age of 65, so we're going to select single. Now, this person does have a child, but that child is over the age of 18. Only those who are under the age of majority would you include here. So we're going to leave that as 0. We're not going to insert any maternity or any dietary needs. We're going to leave those as no. And there's no total monthly income at the time of submission. So we're going to calculate the minimum support now. Okay, so when this page opens, we need to do a little bit of scrolling to go to the top of the page. And this is where our summary is. So right now I can see in summary that there is a total estimated minimum sponsorship cost for startup in the startup column here, $3,065 for this single individual. And the monthly amount is $1,164. When I multiply that monthly amount by 12, it comes out to $13,968. And I have to add that amount with my startup costs. And once I do that, this is my total minimum financial support amount for the year for this single individual. So now, if I were to scroll down, we have startup costs, in-kind deductions that we can make. And so next to each deduction line, we have some more information. So you'll want to hover over and read information that's applicable for you. And so we're not going to make any deductions for in-kind support to the startup costs. But we're going to scroll down and take a look. There is a shelter allowance at 100%. Now, this can be done when someone is living with their sponsors. So a party to the sponsorship, So let's say that this refugee is going to be living with their brother who has signed the undertaking document as a co-sponsor, and they are not going to be charged any rent. So we can deduct this by 100%. And when I hit enter, you'll notice that it also makes the deduction for the housing supplement amount. This housing supplement needs to be included whenever the cost of rent is higher than the monthly minimum that you're required to provide. And in most cases, this is always going to be included. But it does not apply if the cost of shelter is less than the shelter allowance. Okay, so with that deduction in place, you're going to notice that the monthly minimum sponsorship cost has been reduced. So this is what it was originally, $1,164, and the adjusted monthly amount here is now $574. So that's a significant reduction. So when I make in-kind deductions, I always want to make sure that I have proof documentation to demonstrate that I am allowed to make those deductions. So in the case of a shelter allowance, I would need to prove that the person who signed the undertaking document, who is providing shelter, has an apartment that they live in and that the refugees are living there. So an example of proof documentation would be a copy of the rental lease agreement that the co-sponsor has, and it would show how much they pay per month for rent and would have their name and address on that document. And then we would have a document from the refugee showing their residential address. So a piece of mail that comes from an official source, let's say a bank, or their phone bill statement came in the mail and it has their name and address on it. That would be acceptable proof documentation, both of those, the lease and the piece of mail for the refugee, to prove that the co-sponsor is renting a place and that the refugee is living there with them. And so as long as you have that proof documentation to back up the reason you're making that shelter allowance deduction, then that will be acceptable. If you did not have proof documentation and you made these deductions and you went through a case review by IRCC, they are going to have you pay that legal liability amount. So this $1,164 is your legal liability for the monthly amount. So if you can't prove the deductions, then the difference between the $574 and the $1,164 will have to be given to the newcomers. Okay, so if you were to scroll down, if you'd made any special allowances, they would be calculated here. And you can see a total down here for just this principal applicant. And of course, it would include their dependents if you had included any. But one thing to note here is you now have a monthly breakdown for the monthly amounts, how much you need to disperse each month. So that $574 is being shown for each month. Now remember, in the first month, they should also be receiving their startup costs amount at the beginning when they have purchases to make when they first arrive. Now let's scroll up to the top again. So we're going to add the dependent child who is over 18 now. So click on this blue button here. You can add the tab and you will need to click on it in order to do the calculations for this dependent. Now, if you made a mistake, you can simply remove it and there will be a verification. Okay. However, we do need to add a dependent. So I'm going to add that back in there and I'm going to click on that tab and scroll down so I can see what additional questions I may need to respond to. So again, we're not going to indicate this individual as being pregnant, no special dietary needs, and no monthly income. So I'm going to calculate the minimum support amount. And you'll see, if I look at that total summary now, it shows more money because the amounts for this dependent are being added with the principal applicant. And so to see the detailed breakdown between those amounts, we would click this button, Details. And it shows me that for startup costs, this is the principal applicant's amount. And then for startup costs, this is the dependent child who is over 18. So let's scroll down and take a look at the actual calculations for that dependent who's over 18. So when I scroll down, these are the in-kind deductions that can be made for startup costs. We're not going to include any for this demonstration. But one thing I wanted to point out is that the dependent who's over the age of majority is going to be between 18 and 22. And because they're a dependent child, they are entitled to school startup allowance. So that's why you see that the startup cost for this dependent is more than for the principal applicant. And when we scroll down and take a look at the monthly amounts, you can see the legal liability amount, but we haven't added the shelter allowance yet. So let's go ahead and do that because they're going to be living with the brother as well. And you can see the shelter cost has reduced the monthly amount to $574 now. And of course, there's no special allowances being made. And when I take a look at this individual's breakdown of costs, they also have $574 per month for monthly settlement support costs. And you would, again, in the first month, be also giving them the startup costs. Okay, so let's go back to the top and take a look at our summary page. Here's the summary. And again, if you want to see the details of how each is being broken down, you just click on details and it shows you. So you can see when we take a look at the startup costs, again, for the principal applicant, it's $3,065. For the dependent who is over 18, it's $3,365. Added together, we get $6,430. Now, the monthly amount here is before in-kind deductions. If you want to see the deductions, you have to scroll down to this line here, deductions due to in-kind support. So we can see that we didn't apply any startup deductions, but we did apply deductions to the monthly support. So this is the amount that's being deducted from the monthly support, $1,180. When we multiply that amount by 12, we get $14,160. And then that is the amount that's going to be subtracted from the actual legal liability amount, which was $34,366. When we subtract this, the cost of sponsorship now is reduced to $20,206. So you can see there's a significant amount of savings that can be made when the newcomer lives with a party to the sponsorship and is not being charged any rent. And so that's where savings can be made for in-kind deductions. Again, remember to have your proof documents on hand, because if you can't prove that the refugee lived in that space and that the party to the sponsorship, the brother, rents an apartment at that same address, then you will be responsible and legally liable for this $34,366 if you went into a case review by IRCC. Okay, so now that we have these calculations done, I want to save it to my computer. So I'm going to click on download, and these calculations are going to be saved for me. But here it is. We've got the exported file, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. There we go. So now I have the summary information, and you might need to double click on some of these columns to make the information viewable. When you can't see the information, it'll be like little hashtags showing. That's because the information can't be viewed. So you see here, it's all a bunch of hashtags. Just double click on this line here, and that will make the information viewable. So it looks like most of the information you can see now. So when I take a look from the top, so the family size is 1. The composition of adults is single. This is based on the first case scenario. And the community of settlement is Toronto, and there's no children under 18, remember, under the age of majority. And the expected arrival date is, it's assuming 1st of January. That is the default date that's going to be put in there when you check mark unknown date. So when you take a look at the totals, We've got the grand total for the principal applicant, including dependents over the age of majority. So these are your grand total amounts over here. That's what you would have seen in your summary at the top of the web browser page. Then you have the monthly breakdown total. And this is the monthly breakdown total combined. So this isn't a breakdown for each of them to receive. This is combined, but you aren't necessarily giving the combined amount to them. You actually have to give the amounts to them individually. So when you scroll down, you're going to see the breakdown amount for the principal applicant in-kind deductions that you might have applied. We didn't make any for startup costs. And then here's the amount for monthly in-kind amounts. And you can see we did a deduction for housing and shelter amounts. And then there's no special allowances. Then when you get past that special allowances section, you come to the amounts for the adult dependent who is over 18. And again, here's the startup costs, and they have not made any startup cost deductions, but we have made deductions for shelter and housing supplement. No special allowances here. So even though in your report, you can see that there is a monthly breakdown total here, that's so you can budget when you're calculating the total cost of sponsorship to bring the two of them together. However, it is important for you to realize that when you look at each of these tabs, that's why you have the breakdown amount per person. So this dependent who's over the age of majority, this is how much they have to receive themselves in their own bank account. And they themselves have to receive the startup cost amounts in their own bank account, separate and apart from the principal applicant who is their parent. Their parent will receive this amount, and this amount will be in a separate bank account from the dependent who is over 18 as well. And so there you go. That is the minimum financial support calculation tool. So if you happen to find any errors or bugs, things that aren't working correctly when you use the calculator and you're having difficulties, we want you to first clear the browser history and the cookies and the cache. So let me show you a quick demonstration of what that looks like. Okay, so in this web browser, I have these three dots and I need to scroll down to settings. And when I go to the settings, I'm going to select privacy and security. And this is the Chrome browser, the Google Chrome browser. Here's where I can clear the browsing data, my history, cookies, and cache. So I'll click on that. And then you want to check mark the things that you want to clear. So you would check mark browsing history, cached images and files, and that should be sufficient for you. Perhaps auto form data as well, you might want to try. Yeah, and then you're going to select clear data. And once that happens, that should be fixing any errors you might be having. In some cases, you may still have an error occurring. If that's the case, we'd like you to email Paris2 or Sunit, and you can see their email addresses up here on the screen. And when you do so, please be prepared to also provide the family size, composition, and community of settlement